My name is Vanessa Bennett. I'm 31 years old. And on the night my father retired from the trucking empire, he spent 40 years building. I was sitting at table 16, holding a compliance file that could unravel every headline his company had ever earned. Picture the Lowcountry Harbor Club in Charleston, South Carolina. 280 guests under string lights, strung between live oak branches, champagne on silver trays, a jazz quartet playing something slow and expensive. My father, Gerald Bennett, stood on a small stage with a microphone, thanking 40 years of partners, drivers, dispatchers, and investors. Then he introduced his family. My stepmother Diane got a standing ovation for, quote, holding this family together. My stepbrother Tyler got applause for stepping in as the new CEO of Bennett Freight Solutions. 20 minutes before that, Tyler found me near the Raw Bar, a glass of bourbon in his hand and his tie already loosened, the picture of a man who'd been told his whole life he was destined for a stage like this one. Still doing whatever it is you do up in Virginia, he said, not really a question. Compliance work, I said. He laughed into his glass. Compliance. Sounds thrilling. Dad said, you might not even show tonight. I didn't correct him. I've learned that correcting a Bennett rarely changes anything except how satisfied they look afterward. You know he's naming me CEO tonight, Tyler said, leaning in like he was doing me a favor by warning me. Whole company's mine, come January. Maybe it's time you found something that's actually yours. I looked at him for a long moment, at the watch that cost more than my first year of tuition loans. I have something that's mine, I said quietly. You have no idea how much. He laughed, waved a hand like I'd said something charming and a little sad, and walked toward the stage as the lights dimmed. I found my seat at table 16, the back corner, the same seat I'd occupied at every Bennett family function, since I was old enough to notice the seating chart was a message. I remember the exact weight of my clutch bag in my lap, the cold condensation from the water glass against my palm, the smell of candle wax and blackened shrimp drifting over from the buffet. I remember thinking, with the clinical calm I usually reserved for reviewing a client's falsified logbooks, that I already knew what he was about to say before he said it. Because he had said some version of it at every family function since I was 20. The only thing that changed each time was the audience size. Then Gerald's eyes found me. And this is my daughter, Vanessa, he said, smiling. That smile that looked warm from a distance and felt like a blade up close. She never quite figured out what to do with her life. No real career to speak of. But she showed up tonight. So that's something. 280 people laughed. I didn't flinch. I picked up my glass of sparkling water, because I don't drink before a job, and raised it toward the stage. Congratulations, Dad. 40 years. That's quite a legacy to leave behind. I set the glass down without taking a sip. Then I stood, smoothed my blazer, and walked past the dessert table and out the front doors. My heels clicking against the herringbone brick like a metronome, counting down to something. Behind me, silence. The kind of silence that means 280 people are doing math in their heads and getting the same wrong answer I used to get. Let me take you back 12 years, to the day I stopped waiting for my family to see me. If you've ever sat in a room while someone rewrote your entire life story out loud and smiled through it because making a scene would only prove them right, stay with me. This story is about to get very specific about receipts. The Bennetts of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, were old money dressed up as new money, or maybe the other way around. Gerald built Bennett Freight Solutions from 4 trucks into a regional carrier with government contracts and a spot on the Chamber's Wall of Honor. My mother died of a stroke when I was 9. 2 years later, Gerald married Diane, who arrived with a 12-year-old son named Tyler, 3 years older than me. Within a year, I understood the new math of our household. Tyler's report cards got framed. Mine got signed without comment. Tyler got a Jeep at 16. I got his old bicycle with a bent rear derailleur. Tyler was built for this business. I was still finding herself. Nobody screamed at me. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse. I became furniture with a heartbeat, the kind of family member counted in the holiday card, but not in the conversation. Teachers would ask if Tyler and I were close, and Diane would laugh and say, "Oh, they're like night and day, those two," as if that explained why one of us got a college fund and the other got a curfew. I stopped bringing home report cards to show anyone around 14. Once I understood that a 98 on a calculus exam earned me a nod, and Tyler's 74 on the same exam earned him a celebratory steakhouse dinner because he'd worked so hard for it. I did that arithmetic 100 different ways over the years, and it never once balanced. The one person who saw me was my grandmother, Eleanor Bennett, who called every Sunday and asked what I was building in my head. "You notice things other people miss, Vanessa," she told me once. "That's not a small thing, that's a career." She left me something when she died that nobody in the family knew existed. The decision that changed everything happened when I was 20. A sophomore at the University of South Carolina. Accounting, major, 3.9 GPA, with an unpaid summer internship lined up at a forensic accounting firm in Atlanta. Gerald called me home. "Tyler got into the logistics program at Georgia Tech," he said, not looking up from his desk. "We can't fund both his program and your internship. We need you to step back and help at the warehouse instead. Family comes first." Diane smiled. "You'll find your own path eventually, sweetheart. I want to be clear about something, because I think about it every day of my professional life. There was money. I found out years later that Gerald had refinanced 2 properties that same spring and paid Tyler's entire tuition in cash. They simply decided, without discussion, it wasn't going to be spent on me. I didn't argue. I sat there in that leather chair, and I remember the specific sound of the ceiling fan ticking overhead, and the way Diane's fingernails tapped once against his shoulder, a small, approving gesture, like she was scoring a point in a game. Only the two of them. We're playing. I nodded, and made a decision that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with math. I finished my degree auditing invoices at night for a logistics broker in Colombia, run by a retired Army officer named Harold Voss. "You've got the eye for where the numbers lie," he told me. "Learn to read a balance sheet like a crime scene, and you'll never be unemployed a day in your life." I got my certified fraud examiner credential at 24, while working full-time, and learned federal transportation compliance codes. The way other people learn a second language, because in freight, that's where the bodies get buried, inside falsified maintenance logs and driver hour violations dressed up as clerical errors. At 26, I started Sentinel Risk Partners, a compliance and fraud investigation firm, 2 states away in Richmond, Virginia, far enough from Charleston that nobody at a chamber dinner would ever connect the dots between the quiet auditor and the daughter Gerald described as still finding herself. I kept my name off the website, off every piece of marketing material the firm ever produced. Every engagement went through my operations director, Grant Foster, and outside counsel. Clients signed contracts with Sentinel Risk Partners, LLC. They never once had to know that the woman who'd caught their falsified inspection records had grown up eating dinner at a table where she wasn't allowed to speak until spoken to. My grandmother Eleanor died when I was 29. 3 days later, a lawyer named Patricia Hale called. Eleanor had left me a trust 9 years earlier, $760,000, with a letter. "I know what they did to you with that internship money. This is yours, no conditions. When they finally understand what you're capable of, it will already be too late for them to take credit for it." Here's the detail that still turns my stomach. 18 months ago, Bennett Freight Solutions became a client of Sentinel Risk Partners, referred after a near miss with a federal DOT audit that nearly cost Gerald his operating authority in 3 states. Gerald never once met with our team directly. Every engagement letter went out under Grant's signature. Every quarterly compliance report, every finding, every corrective action plan went through a shell layer of account managers and outside counsel specifically. So no one on the client side ever knew whose name was behind the letterhead. My father has spent 18 months praising, at chamber dinners and industry panels, the meticulous outside auditors who kept his company out of federal trouble. He told a room full of his peers, twice, that whoever ran that audit team should be running a Fortune 500 compliance department. He has been praising his own daughter. The one he just told 280 people had no real career to speak of. And the file sitting in my lap at table 16 that night wasn't even the routine quarterly review. It was something else entirely. Something Grant had flagged to me 3 weeks earlier, with a single line in an encrypted message. "You need to see this before we send it." I hadn't told my father that yet. I hadn't told anyone. If you've ever built something in silence because silence was the only language your family ever taught you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Because what happens next, starting with what was actually inside that file, is the part of this story that changes everything. I pulled into a gas station parking lot about 15 minutes outside Charleston and sat there with the engine running, both hands still on the wheel, breathing like I'd just come up from underwater. My phone was already lighting up on the passenger seat, screen flashing over and over against the dark upholstery. I didn't look at it yet. I needed 1 full minute of silence before I let my family back into my head. Let me back up and tell you what was actually in that file, because I promised you receipts, and I meant it. 3 weeks before the gala, Grant sent me that encrypted message at 11 at night. I was still at the office, going through a routine quarterly reconciliation on Bennett Freight Solutions fuel and maintenance accounts. The kind of review we ran automatically for every long-term client. Something in the fuel reimbursement ledger didn't sit right with me. A vendor called Palmetto Fleet Supply had been invoicing Bennett Freight for tire replacements and diesel additive treatments across 11 different trucks every single month for the past 2 years. The dollar amounts were modest individually, somewhere between $800 and $1,400 per invoice, but I don't do casual reviews. That's the whole point of my job. I pulled the DOT registration for Palmetto Fleet Supply. It didn't exist as an active vendor in South Carolina's business registry. I pulled the EIN listed on the invoices and ran it against the IRS database. Grant's team has legal access to for verification purposes. The number belonged to a different company entirely, a defunct landscaping business that had dissolved 4 years earlier. Someone had either fabricated a business identity from scratch or repurposed a dead one. And either way, that's not a clerical error. That's the specific, deliberate architecture of a shell vendor. If you've ever had that moment at work where a small inconsistency turns into something you can't unsee, you already know the feeling I had that night, sitting alone in an empty office, with a laptop and a growing sense of dread. I traced the payments. Over 26 months, Palmetto Fleet Supply had been paid $211,000 by Bennett Freight Solutions. Every invoice was approved by the same authorization code. I asked Grant to pull the employee tied to that code without telling him whose company we were auditing, because I wanted an unbiased answer. It took him 4 minutes. The authorization code belonged to Tyler Bennett, Vice President of Fleet Operations, soon to be CEO. I sat with that for a long time. Not shock, exactly. Something closer to recognition, the way you recognize a smell before your mind has fully placed it. Of course it was Tyler. Of course the golden son, the one who never had to build anything from nothing, had found the one part of the operation nobody else was watching closely enough to catch. I thought about every dinner where Gerald had bragged about Tyler's operational instincts, his sharp eye for cost savings. Tyler had found a cost saving, all right. He'd been saving $211,000 for himself. Here's the part of this job that nobody outside compliance work understands. Finding the fraud is the easy part. Deciding what to do with what you found, especially when it's your own family sitting on the other side of the file, that's the part that keeps you up at night doing math on a legal pad at 2 a.m. I called Patricia Hale the next day. She'd been my grandmother's attorney and mine ever since the trust was settled, and she is the only person outside of Sentinel who knows my full family history. Vanessa, she said, once I'd walked her through the invoices, this isn't a compliance finding anymore. $211,000 routed through a shell vendor with a stolen EIN is embezzlement and likely wire fraud, depending on how the payments were processed. You have an obligation as the engagement lead to report this to the client's board and potentially to federal authorities. I know, I said. I read our own contract. I know exactly what it requires. What I didn't say out loud, not yet, was that the client's board included my father, and the meeting where this would eventually get discussed was very likely going to happen, in a conference room I'd once sat outside of, at 20 years old, waiting to be told there wasn't enough money for my education. 2,000 words in, and I want to check in with you directly for a second. because this is where the story usually loses people who expect revenge to be loud and immediate. It wasn't. It looked like spreadsheets and certified mail and a lot of very quiet, very deliberate waiting. If you've ever had to sit on information that could change everything and had to wait for the right, defensible moment to use it, tell me in the comments, because that waiting is its own kind of exhausting. Grant and I spent the next 2 weeks building what we call, internally, the evidence package. Bank statements showing the Shell vendor's account, opened at a credit union 40 miles from Charleston, funded almost entirely by Bennett Freight Solutions deposits, and drained almost as quickly through ATM withdrawals and transfers to a personal account. Surveillance photos, obtained legally through a licensed investigator's Sentinel contracts with of Tyler, making 3 of those withdrawals himself. Text messages, later confirmed through formal investigation, but already hinted at in software metadata, between Tyler and someone at the credit union. I want to be honest about something. Part of me, a part I'm not proud of, wanted to sit on this evidence a little longer than was strictly necessary, not to protect Tyler, to watch him accept a CEO title he was about to lose, to watch my father call him the future of the company, knowing what I knew. I let myself have that thought for about a day, and then I called Patricia back and told her I needed to do this the right way, not the satisfying way, because Grandma Eleanor's voice was in my head reminding me that the truth is punishment enough, and that I didn't need to make it crueler than it already was. The morning after the gala, my phone showed 14 missed calls, 6 from my father, 4 from Diane, 3 from Tyler, 1 from a Charleston number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be a board member named Walter Combs, a man I'd met exactly once 20 years ago at a company picnic. His voicemail was polite, almost formal. Miss Bennett, this is Walter Combs. I serve on the board at Bennett Freight. I understand from Grant Foster's office that Sentinel has an urgent finding to present to us. I also understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that you may be more connected to this company than any of us realized. I'd like to talk before this goes any further. I listened to that voicemail 4 times. Somewhere between the gala and that Tuesday morning, someone at Sentinel, following our standard escalation protocol for a finding of this severity, had already notified the board that a serious issue needed immediate review. Grant hadn't used my name. He never would, not without my authorization. But Walter Combs had apparently been close enough to table 16 that night, and sharp enough to put 2 facts next to each other and get an answer. Nobody had handed him directly. I called Grant first. Did you say anything about who leads this account? I asked. Nothing, he said. I followed protocol exactly. But Vanessa, people talk, and apparently somebody at that party recognized your name on a badge from a fraud conference 8 months ago. Combs was at that same conference. He'd been trying to figure out for weeks who was really behind the reports that saved his company from a federal shutdown, and Saturday night, watching your father humiliate you on that stage. He finally had a name to attach to it. That afternoon, I called Walter Robertson back. I'm not going to discuss client-specific findings over the phone, Mr. Combs, I said, keeping my voice level and professional. But you will have a complete, documented finding within the week, presented exactly the way we would present it for any client, regardless of any personal connection you believe exists. There was a pause. Understood, he said, and then, quieter, I've known your father for 15 years, Miss Bennett. I think it's long past time somebody in that family understood what he actually has, and what he's been about to lose. Before I hung up, Combs added one more thing I didn't understand the weight of until much later. For what it's worth, he said, your father mentioned once, years ago, at a golf outing, that he had a daughter with an accounting who could have run circles around half the executives in this county if she'd ever gotten the chance. I always assumed he meant a sister somewhere who just wasn't interested in the business. I didn't put it together until Saturday night that he was talking about the woman he'd just called unemployable in front of the entire room. I thanked him and ended the call, then sat perfectly still at my desk, turning that sentence over like a stone in my hand, trying to decide whether it made what my father did worse or simply made it clearer. I hung up and sat in my office looking out over the Richmond skyline. And for the first time since I was years old, these 2 separate halves of my life, the daughter who left with $2,000 and a suitcase, and the auditor who now held her family's entire future in a manila folder, finally lined up into one single undeniable fact. I wasn't hiding from my family anymore. I was simply the last person in the room who understood exactly what was coming. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. 10 in the morning in a conference room on the second floor of Bennett Freight Solutions headquarters, a building I had driven past 100 times in the last 3 years and never once walked into. Grant offered to lead the presentation himself, to keep me out of the room entirely if I wanted that. I told him no. I had built this evidence package the same way I'd built every other one in my career, and I wasn't going to hide from it just because the name on the letterhead happened to be mine by birth. I want to tell you what it felt like walking into that building as Vanessa Bennett, lead auditor, instead of Vanessa Bennett, the daughter who didn't need an education. The receptionist, a woman named Carla, who had worked there since before I left for college, looked up, did a small double take, and glanced down at her visitor log, like she was checking whether her eyes were lying to her. "Miss Bennett," she said carefully, unsure which Miss Bennett she was addressing. I handed her my Sentinel Risk Partners business card, the one with my actual title printed under my actual name for the first time in front of anyone who had known me as a child. 7 board members sat around the mahogany table when I walked in with Grant. My father sat at the head, in the chair he'd occupied at every family holiday, the chair that had always meant he got to decide what was true. Tyler sat 2 seats down, still under the impression, I'd learn later, that this was a routine quarterly compliance update. Gerald's face went through 3 distinct stages when I walked in: confusion, then recognition, then something I had never once seen on him in 31 years, something close to fear. "Good morning," I said, taking the seat Grant had reserved for me at the far end of the table, directly across from my father, the same distance we'd maintained our entire relationship, just formalized now in furniture. "I'm Vanessa Bennett, engagement lead for Sentinel Risk Partners. I'll be presenting today's findings alongside my operations director. If you've ever had to stand professionally calm in a room while your entire chest is doing something closer to freefall, you already understand the next 15 minutes of my life." I walked that board through the fuel account discrepancies, the shell vendor, the repurposed EIN, the authorization codes, the surveillance documentation, all delivered in the same flat, evidence-first language I use for every client, because the moment I let emotion into that presentation was the moment I stopped being credible. Tyler's face went from confused to pale to something close to gray by the 3rd slide. He didn't interrupt. He couldn't. Every figure on that screen came from Bennett Freight's own accounting system, time-stamped and independently verified by a licensed investigator, whose credentials nobody in that room was in any position to challenge. When I finished, the room was silent for what felt like a very long time. Walter Combs was the first to speak. "Thank you, Miss Bennett, for the thoroughness of this report." He didn't say my father's last name like it belonged to him. He said it like it belonged to me. "I'd like to formally move that this board place Tyler Bennett on immediate administrative leave, pending a full independent investigation and referral to the appropriate federal authorities." My father stood up so fast, his chair rolled backward into the credenza behind him. "This is absurd," he said, his voice climbing in a way I'd genuinely never heard from him before, not even the night of the tuition decision. "This is my son. This is my company. You cannot possibly expect this board to take action based on a report from." He stopped, apparently unable to finish the sentence with either word he'd been about to use, daughter or stranger, because neither one fit the woman standing in front of him, with a folder that could end everything he'd spent 40 years building. "From my daughter?" I finished for him, quietly. "That's the word you're looking for, Dad. I am your daughter. I've been your daughter this entire time. Even during the 18 months, your company paid mine for the exact expertise you told 280 people I didn't have." 2,000 words into this chapter, and I want to pause here for a second, because this is the part of my life I think about the most. Not the confrontation. The arithmetic. Sitting in that boardroom, watching my father's face collapse into something almost unrecognizable, I finally did the math I'd been avoiding for 12 years. I wasn't his daughter in any way that had ever mattered to him. I was infrastructure. I was the quiet system running underneath the visible parts of his life, the parts he introduced on stages and put on Christmas cards, the parts that got Jeeps and MBA programs and standing ovations. I was load-bearing and invisible, exactly the way infrastructure is supposed to be, until the day it fails, and everyone suddenly notices how much weight it was holding up. If you've ever realized mid-conversation that you were never actually family to someone, just useful, tell me in the comments, because that realization changes the shape of every memory you have. The board voted 5-1 to place Tyler on administrative leave. My father cast the single vote against. Walter Combs made a second motion, this one directed at outside counsel, to initiate a formal referral to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, given the interstate nature of the fraudulent transactions and the size of the MIPC's appropriated funds. That motion passed unanimously, including, after a long pause, my father's own vote, because even he understood that voting against a federal referral on the record, as chairman, would end his career faster than the fraud itself. Tyler found me in the parking garage afterward, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette he clearly didn't usually smoke. "You did this on purpose," he said, sat on it for months waiting for the worst moment to destroy me. "I found it 3 weeks ago," I told him. "I didn't create the shell vendor. I didn't approve $211,000 in fraudulent invoices under my own authorization code. You did that, Tyler, a long time before I ever opened that file." He stared at me, and for the first time in 20 years, I watched him actually see me. Not as a footnote at family dinners, but as someone who'd been quietly capable of ending him the entire time. He called her compliance work-thrilling. My father caught me at my car. "Vanessa," he said, his voice gone soft, almost pleading, a tone I didn't recognize. "Whatever you think of me, I need this company to survive this. 30 years of employees, drivers with families. This isn't just my legacy. I know exactly what's at stake, Dad," I said. "I've known since the moment I found that shell vendor. That's precisely why I did this the right way, instead of the way that would have hurt you most." His jaw tightened, that old familiar movement I'd watched my entire childhood, and for once I didn't flinch, waiting for what came next, because there was nothing left he could take from me that he hadn't already taken 12 years ago in that study with the mahogany desk, and the promise he never kept. I drove straight from that parking garage to a diner off Highway 17, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that's been on the burner too long, because I needed somewhere ordinary to sit and let my hands stop shaking. My phone rang while I was stirring cream into coffee I didn't actually want. An unfamiliar number, area code from upstate South Carolina. Something made me answer. "Vanessa, it's your Uncle Robert." My mother's younger brother, a man I hadn't spoken to since before her funeral, 22 years ago, when Gerald made it clear, without ever saying so directly, that Robert's side of the family wasn't invited back after the service. I heard about what's happening at Bennett Freight. Small industry, word travels. I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago, and I've been a coward about it for over a decade. "Your mother set up an education fund for you before she got sick," Robert said. "An actual account, funded from her side of the family, earmarked for your college tuition. She made Gerald promise, in front of me and our own mother, it would never be touched for anything else. When she died, it had enough to cover your entire undergraduate degree without a single loan." I gripped the edge of the table. "What happened to it?" I asked, though some cold part of me already knew. "Gerald drained it 2 years before he told you. There wasn't enough money for your internship," Robert said. "He used it, along with a home equity loan, to cover Tyler's private school tuition, and, later, his Georgia Tech program. I found out by accident, going through paperwork, after your mother's estate closed. I confronted him once, and he told me it was none of my business, and that I should mind my place if I wanted to keep attending family gatherings. I was afraid of losing what little relationship I had left with your mother's memory, so I let it go. I've regretted that every day since." "Your grandmother, Eleanor, found out too," Robert continued. "Years later, going through some of your mother's old files. That's why she set up that trust for you, the way she did, completely separate, with instructions. Gerald never be told. She told me once she couldn't undo what he'd already stolen from you. but she'd be damned if she let him get anywhere near what was coming next. If you've ever discovered that a betrayal you already knew about was actually deeper and older than you realized, you understand exactly what I felt sitting in that diner booth, doing a different kind of arithmetic than the one I do for a living. This wasn't just about an internship I didn't get to take at 20. It was about a mother who had tried, even from beyond her own death, to protect a future. Her husband quietly dismantled before I'd even finished grieving her. "Thank you for telling me," I finally said. 12 years late is still better than never. He was quiet a moment. "I'd like to see you sometime if you're willing," he said. "I owe your mother that much, and I think I owe you a lot more." I told him I would call him soon, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I meant a promise without a single reservation attached to it. I sat in that diner a while longer, thinking about Eleanor's letter, about the phrase she'd used, that it would already be too late for them to take credit for it. I understood now. She hadn't just meant Sentinel, or any single business achievement. She'd meant this exact moment. The moment I finally had every piece of the truth in front of me at once. My mother's stolen fund, my own stolen internship, Tyler's stolen $211,000. All of it laid end to end into one long, unbroken pattern that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with who my father decided, decades ago, was worth investing in. 6 weeks after that board meeting, I sat down and wrote the only letter I ever intended to send my father. Not an email, not a text, a physical letter, because some things deserve the weight of paper and ink, instead of the disposability of a notification that disappears into a scroll of other notifications. I went through 4 drafts. The first was too angry. The second sounded like a legal brief. The third tried too hard to sound forgiving, and it wasn't honest. The final version was short. "Dad, I want you to have the facts, since facts are the only thing you've ever fully respected in me. Sentinel Risk Partners is mine." I built it alone, starting with $2,000 and a job auditing invoices for a man who believed I had a mind worth investing in. For 18 months, the daughter you called unemployable, in front of 280 people, kept your company compliant with federal transportation law. I also know about the education fund. Mom left me, and what you did with it. Uncle Robert told me everything. I'm not writing this looking for an apology, and I'm not writing it looking for a reconciliation. I'm writing it because Grandma Eleanor once told me that the truth is punishment enough, and I finally understand what she meant. I wish you well with what's left of the company. I won't be attending any more Bennett family events, and I'd ask that you not reach out. Vanessa Margaret Bennett. I included my mother's name deliberately. The middle name I'd started using on legal documents 3 years earlier. The one piece of her I'd carried forward into every version of myself she never got to see. I want to walk you through what happened to Bennett Freight Solutions after that letter. Because this is the part of the story where the consequences stopped being something I orchestrated and simply became something that happened, the natural result of choices my father and stepbrother had made years before I ever opened that shell vendor file. The federal referral moved faster than anyone expected. Investigators from the Department of Transportation's Office of Inspector General, working alongside the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, spent 4 months building a case against Tyler that ultimately included not just the $211,000 in fraudulent fuel invoices, but a separate scheme involving falsified driver, hours of service logs he'd personally approved to keep trucks running past federal safety limits. That second discovery had nothing to do with me. It came from federal investigators doing their own independent review. Once the initial fraud case opened the door, I learned about the safety log discovery, the same way most of Charleston did, through a Business Journal article. Grant forwarded me with no commentary attached, just the headline and a question mark. I read it twice, sitting in my office with the harbor visible through the window, and felt something more complicated than vindication. Drivers had been pushed past federal rest limits for years, under Tyler's operational leadership, the same operational instincts my father had bragged about at every family dinner I'd ever sat through, quietly resentful, in the back corner seat reserved for the disappointment. Those drivers had families too, mortgages, kids in school, the same ordinary stakes. Every person in that ballroom had pretended not to notice, while they laughed at my father's joke about my worthlessness. It struck me that the family who'd spent 22 years insisting I wasn't serious enough for real responsibility had been quietly cutting corners on actual human safety the entire time, and nobody had noticed. Because nobody had been looking closely enough. Except me. That was the entire problem, as far as they were concerned. Tyler pleaded guilty 8 months later to wire fraud and falsification of federal safety records, and received a sentence that included restitution, probation, and a permanent bar from holding an executive position at any DOT-regulated carrier. My father stepped back into an active leadership role at 63. 3 years past the retirement he'd celebrated at that gala. Because the board needed someone with institutional knowledge to stabilize the company, while an external CEO search got underway. He gave interviews to the Charleston Business Press about integrity and accountability, language that would have sounded hollow to me if I hadn't already decided, somewhere around that diner booth, off Highway 17, that his choices were no longer mine to manage or resent. Deanne called me twice more, after my letter arrived, voicemails that shifted, message by message, from wounded to conciliatory to something close to threatening, mentioning family obligations and blood being thicker than water. I didn't call back. Patricia Hale sent a formal cease and desist letter after the third attempt at contact came through a mutual acquaintance instead of directly, and the calls stopped entirely after that. Boundaries. I've learned only work when you're willing to enforce them with the same precision you'd bring to any other contract. If you've ever had to watch the consequences of someone else's decisions unfold without lifting a finger to help or hurt them, you understand the strange, quiet peace of that distance. I wasn't cheering. I wasn't grieving. I was simply, finally, no longer responsible for how the story ended for people who had never once felt responsible for how it ended for me. Let me tell you about the part of this that actually matters. The part I think about more than the boardroom, or the letter, or the federal indictment. 3 months after the gala, I started seeing a therapist in Richmond, not because I was falling apart, but because I finally had the stability to look directly at 22 years of being treated like a line item instead of a daughter. We talked about invisibility, about the specific exhaustion of building an entire career in secret, because you've learned that visibility invites either theft or sabotage. We talked about grief, the strange kind that comes from losing people who are still alive, still sending the occasional certified letter through their own attorney, trying to reopen a conversation. I'd already closed. Uncle Robert and I have dinner now, once a month, sometimes twice, usually at a small seafood place near his house, where he orders the same fried flounder every time, and tells me stories about my mother that Gerald never told me, that she loved terrible puns, hummed off-key, once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm, just to see a college friend's newborn. I didn't know any of that until I was 31. I know it now, and I hold on to every detail like it's evidence in the best case I've ever built, because in a way, it is. I want to be honest about one more thing before I finish this, because it's the piece people skip when they tell revenge stories. I visited Grandma Eleanor's grave the week the sentencing was finalized, and sat there a long time in the grass, telling her out loud what had happened. The board meeting, the letter, the federal case, all of it. The way I used to tell her about my week every Sunday of my childhood. I told her I'd tried to do it the way she would have wanted, honest instead of cruel, documented instead of dramatic. If I listened closely enough, I could almost hear her voice telling me she was proud, the same way she always had been, long before anyone else in that family bothered to notice. Sentinel Risk Partners has grown since that spring. We're up to 26 employees now, offices in Richmond, and a second location in Raleigh. And I no longer keep my name entirely off the public-facing materials, because hiding it was never actually protecting me from my family. It was just one more way of making myself smaller, for people who had never once made room for me at full size. Here's what I want you to take from this, because if you've stayed with me through all 4 chapters, you've earned the honest version instead of the tidy one. Your worth was never something your family got to determine, no matter how many titles they hold or how loudly they laugh when they think they're the only ones with the microphone. Worth isn't inherited, and it isn't awarded by the people who are supposed to love you best. It's built quietly in the years. Nobody's watching, in the decision, made over and over, to keep showing up for yourself even when no one else will. My father spent an entire retirement speech trying to define who I was in front of 280 witnesses. What he never understood is that I had already spent 12 years defining myself, one certified credential and one client contract at a time. And by the time he opened his mouth on that stage, his opinion of me had already stopped being able to touch the woman I'd actually become. If any part of this story found you, if you've ever sat at a family table feeling like furniture instead of family, if you've ever built something extraordinary in silence because you learned early that visibility only invited people to take credit or tear it down, I want you to know you're not alone in that, and you're not required to keep shrinking yourself for people who never once made space for you. If this story meant something to you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I have more stories like this one to tell, and I'd genuinely love to have you here for the next one. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and if any piece of Vanessa's story felt like your own, tell me that too. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next one.